June 1944, Camp Scottsbluff, Nebraska. 40 German prisoners of war sat stiffly at outdoor tables, their eyes scanning for the trap they were sure was coming. They had been taught that Americans were savages, that civilization ended at Germany's borders. Then the farmers came out carrying platters of golden-grilled corn, butter melting down the sides, and placed them in front of the prisoners. Hans Pfizer stared. In Germany, corn was animal feed, food for pigs. At first, the men laughed bitterly. One of them muttered, "They feed us like livestock, just as the Führer warned." But then Earl, one of the American farmers, who had lost his own son in the war, picked up an ear of corn, bit into it, and looked Hans straight in the eye. "This," he said quietly, "is what free men eat." One by one, the Germans tasted the corn. Their expressions changed, first surprise, then something deeper. They realized they had been lied to about everything. A simple vegetable had shattered a lifetime of propaganda. 3 weeks into captivity, Hans had already built a routine. Wake up in the morning, wash at the pump, line up for work, keep your head down, do your duty, don't think too much. It wasn't hard work to think about. The sugar beet farms needed labor. Every able-bodied American man was either fighting overseas or working in factories, and crops don't wait. So the prisoners went out in groups of 10, watched over by guards riding in the back of trucks. The field stretched wider than anything Hans had ever seen back in Germany. The work was exhausting, the sun relentless, but there were water breaks, real breaks. Tin cups passed around, guards who almost looked sorry for the heat. Hans usually worked beside Deer, quiet, steady, the kind of silence that felt like two soldiers sharing the same foxhole. The American farmers were distant but fair. They showed what needed to be done, how to thin the rows, pull weeds, avoid damaging the young plants, and then left them to it. No beatings, no shouting, just honest labor under a sky so wide it almost hurt to look at. "This isn't what I expected," Klaus said one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow. He was young, too young, still believed the war would turn around any day now and they'd go home as heroes. "It's exactly what we expected," Hans snapped back. "Soft, using us for labor instead of fighting their own battles." But even as he said it, he caught sight of one of the American farmers, broad-shouldered, sunburned, built like an ox, working the same rows beside them. The man's hands were as rough as Hans's father's had been. His back bent the same way under the weight of work. When he straightened to take a drink, there was no softness in his face, just tired resolve. Deer looked at Hans, saw the thought forming, and said nothing. That was his way, letting you face the uncomfortable truths on your own. By the end of the 3rd week, something strange had happened. The work crews had become efficient. The Americans had learned to show with gestures instead of shouting in English. The Germans learned which farmers wanted the rows spaced exactly 4 inches apart, and which didn't mind 5. There was still no real conversation. The barbed wire of language and history stood between them, but there was rhythm now, a quiet understanding. Then came the news from Earl Hutchins's farm. Private Tommy Chin, the camp translator, read it out loud during evening roll call. Starting Monday, Group 3 would move to the Hutchins farm, a 2-week assignment harvesting sugar beets and corn. Hans was part of Group 3, along with Deer, Klaus, and 8 others, including Kurt Zimmer, the son of a former Gestapo informant. Every evening, Kurt reminded everyone that they were still German soldiers, not American pets. "I know the Hutchins farm," one guard muttered to another. "Not exactly a quiet place. Earl lost his boy in Normandy. Should be interesting." A chill ran through Hans's stomach. A father who had lost his son, now hosting a team of German prisoners. This, he thought, is where the polite mask of the Geneva Convention will break. This is where grief and rage might finally show their teeth. Saturday brought the first surprise. Margaret Hutchins, clearly ignoring her husband's wishes, had arranged a community cookout. It was a local tradition, Tommy the translator explained, looking uneasy. The event marked the end of the summer harvest for all the work crews, American families and German prisoners together. "She's been doing it for 15 years, Tommy said, his translator's voice carefully neutral. "She says the war won't change that." The barracks erupted. Some prisoners laughed nervously, others stared in disbelief. A few grew quiet, doing grim calculations in their heads. Kurt Zimmer stood in the center, his voice slicing through the noise. "It's a trap or a humiliation," he spat. "They want to see us beg for their scraps." "Or maybe," Deer said softly, "it's the Geneva Convention. They follow the rules, too." "Rules?" Kurt snapped. "You think this is about rules? They want us to forget who we are, forget our duty. Our brothers are still fighting." Hans felt 40 pairs of eyes turned toward him. He was younger than Deer, less intimidating than Kurt, but something about his calm certainty made him the barracks' quiet conscience, the one who reminded them not to grow too comfortable, not to forget. "We'll go," Hans said finally, his voice steady. "If we must eat their food, we'll eat it, but we won't forget not who we are, not what they've done." When he said it, it felt powerful, like resistance, like pride. But that night, lying on his bunk, Hans felt something crack inside his chest, a hairline fracture in the armor he'd clung to. Because the truth was, he didn't know what to expect anymore. Would Earl Hutchins spit in his face? Would he shoot him? Or would he just stand there, silent and broken, while Hans worked the same soil his dead son once tended? By Sunday evening, Hans knew one thing for certain. He would walk onto that farm, and no training, no propaganda, not even fear could prepare him for what came next. The sun hung low as they marched down the dirt road toward Earl Hutchins's land. 10 German prisoners, guarded by 2 American soldiers who clearly wished they were somewhere else. Hans kept his spine straight, his face blank. Whatever this was, a test, a humiliation, some vast American psychological game, he would endure it with dignity. Then he saw them. Long wooden tables under the cottonwood trees, their leaves glowing gold in the evening light. American families stood in clusters, farmers recognizing their wives from the fields, children darting between tables with carefree laughter, never knowing war on their own soil. Near the barn, a small band was tuning instruments. The air carried a mix of smells, charcoal smoke, roasted meat, and something sweet Hans couldn't quite name. Margaret Hutchins emerged from the farmhouse carrying a basket. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, her face marked with the deep lines of private grief and public grace, the kind of woman who had cried alone and smiled for others. She nodded politely at the prisoners, her eyes kind but cautious, then gestured toward the tables. "Please, Tommy, tell them, sit, eat." The Germans sat stiffly at one end, straight as fence posts. Across from them, the Americans leaned together, their voices fading as both sides studied each other across 10 feet of grass that felt like a minefield. Hans could feel Kurt Zimmer's eyes on him, measuring, judging, waiting to see if anyone would break rank. Then the food arrived. The farm wives moved between the tables, carrying dishes of fried chicken glistening with grease, potato salad mixed with eggs and pickles, and biscuits so fresh they steamed when broken open. Thick slices of tomato, still warm from the Sunday sun, were passed down the line. The smell hit Hans like a wave. For years he hadn't seen a meal like this, not rations, not survival food, but abundance. An American farmer, middle-aged, weathered, the same man Hans had worked beside that week, walked up and placed a plate directly in front of the German prisoners. On it, laid out almost like an offering, were ears of corn, charred from the grill, butter melting in golden streams down the sides, still crackling faintly in the heat. Hans stared. Deer said nothing. "Corn. Animal feed, pig food. The stuff you feed to livestock before slaughter." Klaus looked at Hans, puzzled. Another prisoner, a former Bavarian farm owner, gave a short, sharp laugh. "Animal feed," he said loudly in German. "They're feeding us like cattle." The laughter spread, nervous at first, then bitter. A cruel confirmation of everything they'd been told. Americans had no culture, no civilization. They probably ate with their hands and slept in barns. Then Earl Hutchkin stood up so suddenly, his chair crashed onto the packed dirt. The yard fell silent, even the children stopped running. Hands looked up. Earl was a big man, not tall, but built like stone, shoulders hardened by decades of work, hands that looked strong enough to snap fence posts. His face was carved with an old, deep sorrow that reached all the way to his temples. He walked toward the German table, and Hans felt every muscle in his body tighten, bracing for the blow. Margaret reached for her husband's arm. "Earl." But Earl didn't look at her. He picked up an ear of corn from the platter and held it for a moment. Something flickered across his face, a memory, maybe, or a pain too deep for words. Then he bit into it. Butter ran down his chin. He chewed slowly, deliberately, and locked eyes with Hans. When he spoke, his voice was rough as gravel. "My boy loved this. It was the last thing I cooked for him before he shipped out." He paused, the silence heavy as stone. "He died fighting your country's war." Then Earl lifted the corn, juice running down his wrist. "This," he said, "is what free men eat." He dropped the cob onto the table. The wooden thud echoed like a gunshot. Then he turned and walked away, back straight, hands trembling. Hans couldn't breathe. The laughter around him had died completely. The other prisoners sat frozen, caught between defiance and something else, something dangerously close to shame. Deer stepped forward slowly, picked up an ear of corn as if it might explode, then bit into it. His face stayed carefully neutral. His eyes widened. "My God, Hans," he whispered, "try it." Hans shook his head, his jaw tight. No, this was the line. He couldn't, he wouldn't. But Klaus had already reached for one. Awkwardly at first, then with more confidence. His expression softened, confusion melting into surprise, then wonder. Another prisoner followed, then another. Hans watched them, fear and confusion battling in his chest, as the men around him tasted something they'd been told their whole lives could never exist. Something simple, something good, something human. Across the yard, Earl Hotkin stood with his back to everyone. His wife's hand rested gently on his shoulder, and his whole body trembled as he tried not to break down. At that moment, Hans suddenly understood, and the realization hit him hard. This wasn't psychological warfare. This wasn't some clever trick. It was just a father serving his dead son's favorite food to his son's enemies, because his wife had asked him to choose kindness over hate. And Hans simply smiled. Something about that corn had changed him. He couldn't name it, didn't want to admit it, but over the next few weeks, he felt it growing inside him. It was slow, painful, and impossible to ignore, like a broken bone healing the wrong way. Work went on. The sugar beets were harvested and replaced by late-season vegetables. The German sailors moved through Earl's fields with the same skill and discipline they'd once used aboard ships. But now, small moments began to appear, moments that quietly chipped away at the wall between the two sides. An American farmer hummed a tune while he worked, Mozart, of all things. Hans froze. His mother used to play that same song on their old piano. Klaus showed a guard a picture of his little sister. The guard pulled out his own wallet and showed a photo of a girl with the same crooked-toothed smile. Dirk repaired a broken irrigation pump, something that had left the farm's regular mechanic stumped. The man, once cold and dismissive, looked at Dirk with reluctant respect. Hans noticed everything, but pretended not to. He worked harder than anyone else, as if exhausting his body could silence the questions in his mind. These Americans weren't soft. They worked beside their prisoners from sunrise to sunset, their hands rough and their backs bent just like theirs. They sang strange songs about trains and heartbreak, songs that reminded Hans of German soldiers before Normandy, when everything was still dark and uncertain. Earl rarely spoke to the prisoners directly, but his presence was constant. Hans watched him the way a soldier studies enemy territory, looking for weakness, for the moment the mask slips. But there was no mask. Earl was simply a man carved by grief, surviving by keeping busy. Sometimes Hans saw him staring at the far field, the one with the tallest corn, his face so raw with emotion that Hans had to look away. It had been easier when the Americans were monsters, when the enemy stayed the enemy. Then one Wednesday near the end of August, everything changed. The heat rose above 100 degrees, and the air felt thick enough to choke on. Klaus was working on the irrigation line when he stumbled. Hans thought he'd tripped and started to scold him for not paying attention. But then Klaus collapsed to the ground and didn't get up. Everything happened both fast and slow. Hans ran to him, shouting for help. Dirk lifted Klaus, trying to cool him down. The boy's skin had turned gray, his breathing was shallow. He'd stroke every sign of it. And then Earl was there. He dropped to his knees in the dirt, his large hands suddenly gentle as he lifted Klaus like he weighed nothing at all. "Get him in the shade," Earl barked, already moving. "Tommy, call the camp doctor, now." They carried Klaus toward the barn. Earl held the boy close, steadying his head as if it might break. Margaret appeared with wet cloths and ice, wrapped in towels from the cellar. Earl laid Klaus down in the coolest spot, pressing ice against his neck and wrists, speaking in English the boy couldn't understand. But somehow, Klaus still seemed to respond. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the tone, the urgency, the sound of someone refusing to let another person die. "Stay with me, son," Earl kept saying. "Stay right here." Klaus's eyes fluttered. He started to cry, whispering in German so fast that Tommy couldn't translate. Dummkopf, dank." "Idiot, idiot, thank you." Earl's jaw tightened. He didn't move until the camp doctor arrived. Even then, he just stood there, stunned, like he couldn't believe what he'd just done. He had saved an enemy soldier. He had called him son. From the barn doorway, Hans watched, his throat tight with something he refused to name. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't a trick. Earl Hopkins had lost his own son to Hans's country, to Hans's war, to a bullet fired by someone wearing the same uniform as him. And yet Earl had still run to save Klaus. He had still carried him as if he mattered. That night, as Klaus recovered in the camp infirmary, Hans lay awake on his bunk and finally allowed himself to ask the question he had been avoiding for weeks. Did they lie to us? His voice was barely a whisper in the dark. "About what?" murmured Dirk from the next bed. "About everything." Dirk was quiet for a long moment, then he sighed. "Eat the corn, Hans, it's just corn." But yes, they lied about everything. Hans closed his eyes, feeling his entire world tilt off its axis. If they'd lied about the Americans being monsters, what else had they lied about? The 1,000-Year Reich, the master race. The noble, righteous war. If corn, once pig food, could be shared freely between men. If the enemy could love Mozart and show kindness. Then maybe Hans Fischer had spent his whole life believing a story that was never true. And that thought was more terrifying than any battlefield he had ever faced. By the end of August, something had quietly changed, something no one dared to say aloud. The workers no longer felt like prisoners guarded by enemies. Not exactly friends, but something close. A rhythm and understanding. The Americans taught the Germans how to play baseball during lunch breaks, demonstrating how to swing the bat and run the bases with big, exaggerated gestures. The Germans, in return, taught card games that needed no shared language, just focus, memory, and the universal urge to win. Klaus picked up English at an alarming rate, his young mind soaking up words like rain into dry soil. Even Kurt Zimmer, once obsessed with speeches about loyalty and duty, had stopped preaching, though he still watched everyone with narrowed eyes, mentally keeping a list of traitors to report someday. Hans often found himself working beside Earl. Neither man spoke much, but there was communication in every small gesture. The way Earl pointed toward a weed, or Hans nodded toward a dry patch of soil that needed water. Once, Hans picked up Earl's dropped hat and handed it back. Earl gave a short nod. That was enough. On Fridays, Margaret brought pies, apple cherry, even once a custard that nearly made Klaus cry with joy. The prisoners began asking for corn at every meal, and the camp cook gave in, grilling it just the way Earl had shown him. Hans ate it now without thinking. It tasted familiar. Good. Only sometimes did he feel the faint ghost of shame for how he'd laughed that first night. In early September, Earl let Hans work in the far field, the one with the sweetest corn. Hans caught Earl watching it with that same raw, broken expression. Without a word, Earl handed Hans the tools and walked away. Hans understood. This was Joseph's field, his son's field. And Earl was trusting an enemy soldier to care for it. Hans worked that land as if it were sacred. Because it was. For one golden moment, suspended in the late summer heat, surrounded by tired bodies and shared meals. The war felt far away. Not over, never that, but distant. Like a storm on the horizon that might, by some miracle, pass them by. Peace no longer felt impossible. It felt like the corn itself, standing tall and straight. Like laughter crossing a language barrier. Like the weight of Earl's hand on Hans's shoulder. One afternoon, when Hans fixed something in the irrigation line just right. Earl's hand brushed his shoulder, a brief touch, almost nothing. But it burned like a brand. Then September came, bringing news that shattered everything. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday. Hans was working in a nearby field when Tommy appeared, his translator's face carefully blank, the kind of blankness that only came before terrible news. "Hans Fisher," he said quietly, "report to the camp office." As Hans walked there, it felt like he was sinking underwater. His mind ran through possibilities, transfer, punishment, maybe a letter from his mother after months of silence. He wasn't prepared for the Red Cross officer, for the thin paper in the man's hand, for the words that tore his world open again. His brother Friedrich, 16 years old, had been killed in Hamburg during an Allied bombing raid. Hans heard the words, he understood them. But his body refused to believe it. He just stood there as the officer offered condolences in careful, diplomatic German. Tommy translated anyway, because protocol demanded it, though Hans by now spoke enough English to understand every word. When Hans finally returned to the barracks, the numbness broke into rage. Friedrich, his little brother, the boy who had looked up to him, who had written letters full of Hitler Youth slogans and innocent faith that Germany would win. And now he was dead, crushed beneath American bombs, dropped from American planes, flown by men who might have looked like Earl, like the guards, like the men who had taught him baseball. That evening, Hans couldn't even look at them. He couldn't bear to sit through another meal, another conversation pretending they weren't enemies. He found Earl by the tool shed, and the words came out like bullets. "They killed my brother." His English cracked, anger sharpening every syllable. "Your people, your bombs. You talk about peace, about corn, but your people kill children." Earl's face went white, then red. His hands curled into fists. "And your people killed my son," he snapped. 10 feet separated them, two fathers, both drowning in grief. And the fragile bridge they'd been building for weeks shattered in an instant. All the shared meals, all the careful gestures of trust, every fragile spark of understanding gone. Burned away in the fire of bombs and bullets, in the unbearable weight of war. Hans turned away before he could do something he'd never forgive. He forgot that even anger has limits. For 3 days, he refused to leave his bunk. He lay there while the others went to work, ignoring every order. The camp commander threatened punishment. Dirk pleaded for patience. Kurt Zimmer muttered about weakness, about how compassion was corrupting them all. Hans didn't care. He stared at the picture in his hand, a pencil sketch of Friedrich, 14, smiling in his Hitler Youth uniform, full of belief in everything they'd been taught. Dirk brought him food. Hans wouldn't touch it. No bread, no thin soup, not even water, until his lips cracked and Dirk finally pressed a canteen to his mouth. On the 3rd evening, Dirk came back with a tray that smelled different. Hans turned his face to the wall. "Why are you torturing me?" he rasped, his voice raw, barely human. The package had been placed with deliberate care. On top was a single ear of hot, roasted corn, because remembering that you were human, truly human, was not torture. Forgetting was. Hans wanted to throw it away. He wanted to scream that humanity was a lie, that kindness was a trick. The only truth lay in his brother's death, in Earl's son, in all the deaths that stacked up until no one was left undefeated, until everyone had passed. But he was so tired, so exhausted, so bone-weary from carrying hatred like armor. He didn't eat the corn, but he didn't throw it away either. That night Earl couldn't sleep. He tried everything, lying quietly, reading scripture, helping Margaret with dishes, until she gently nudged him toward bed. Nothing worked. His mind kept returning to Hans's face, to that raw grief that mirrored his own, to the horrifying truth that they were both fathers who had lost sons, and that war did not pause to consider the symmetry of suffering. In the middle of the night, Earl gave up. He put on his boots and walked toward the camp fence. He didn't know what he was doing, had no plan. He only knew that staying in bed was impossible. The camp was silent except for the glow of a single lit barrack, Hans's barrack. Earl stood there a long time, holding the last letter from his son folded in his pocket as he had for months. He had read it so many times that the folds were beginning to tear. "Tell her I love him. Tell her I'm careful. Tell her this will all be over soon and I'll come home, and we'll eat corn, and everything will be as it was." But it would not be, never could be, because Joseph was gone and Earl's heart was broken, and no amount of corn or prayer or anger could fix it. Moved, perhaps, by something even deeper than grief, something dangerously close to grace, Earl walked to his truck, went home, and 20 minutes later returned with a bundle wrapped in cloth. He left it at the gate with a guard, along with a pencil-written note on the back of a feed bill, his handwriting trembling. The next morning Hans found it. The guard approached him with an expression that said he expected Hans to read the note and understand nothing, yet follow orders anyway. Hans slowly unfolded the cloth. Inside was a jar of preserves, the label written in careful script, Margaret's strawberry, Joseph's favorite. The note was simple, direct. Every word seemed carved from stone. "My son's name is Joseph. He was 19. I hate that he is gone. I hate this war. But I do not hate you. This is all I have left to give." Hans read it 3 times, then a 4th. His hands shook. Tears rolled down his face before he could stop them. Not the calm kind of tears, but fragile tears, tears that came from a place so deep he had forgotten it existed. He cried for Friedrich, for Joseph, for every boy who had believed lies and died for them. For himself, for the part of him that had died in Normandy, and somehow tried to return to life in a Nebraska prison camp. Dirk found him like that, collapsed over the note, hands trembling as he held the jar as if it were made of glass. Dirk said nothing, just sat beside him. Finally, when Hans could speak, his voice wasn't a whisper. "He lost his son to us." "He does not hate you," Dirk said quietly. "He does not." How? The question came out frustrated, bewildered. How could anyone do that? Dirk was silent for a long time. "I think this is what they're trying to show us. Choosing not to hate, that's the hard part, that's the real strength." Hans looked at the jar in his hands. The note was proof that Earl Hutchins had gone into the camp in the middle of the night to give an enemy a gift, costing nothing yet everything. And Hans finally understood. It was not weakness. It was courage. Courage, stripped of propaganda, lies, and war, is visible in its rawest, most impossible form.